What do you do when your wife's friend smiles and says, "She's not with me, she's away with another man. I'm a building superintendent, I see everything, and I'm about to show them both what happens when you betray the man who controls the locks. My name is Ethan Grant, and I have spent the last 6 years of my life keeping this building running like a well-oiled machine, making sure every light bulb gets changed on time, every tenant complaint gets addressed before it turns into a lawsuit, and every access log gets filed away in case the insurance company comes sniffing around. I am the superintendent of a mid-rise condo building in the kind of neighborhood where people pay good money to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel like someone is watching over them while they sleep, and that someone has always been me. I learned how to watch in the military, back when watching meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. And I brought that same discipline to this job, to this building, to this life I thought I was building with my wife Laura. She used to joke that I could spot a burnt-out hallway bulb from 3 floors away, that I had eyes in the back of my head, that nothing got past me, and I would smile and tell her that was the point, that someone had to keep the chaos at bay. I never told her that the real skill was not just seeing everything, but knowing what to do with what you see, knowing when to act and when to wait, knowing how to let the truth do the work for you instead of forcing it out into the open before it is ready to stand on its own. It was a Thursday evening, just after 6, and I was walking through the lobby on my way back from replacing a faulty smoke detector on the 8th floor when I saw Nina Cross standing by the mailboxes with a yoga mat slung over her shoulder and that easy smile she always wore, the kind of smile that made you think she had never had a bad day in her life. Nina was Laura's friend, or at least I thought she was, one of those people who floated in and out of our lives during weekend brunches and charity fundraisers, always talking about wellness and intention and letting the universe guide you. And I had never paid much attention to her beyond the polite nods and small talk that husbands are expected to perform when their wives bring friends around. She waved at me as I crossed the lobby, and I waved back, already thinking about the maintenance request I needed to file for the 3rd-floor water heater. But then she called out my name, and I stopped because there was something in her voice that did not match the smile. Something that sounded almost rehearsed, like she had been waiting for this moment and was now committed to seeing it through. She asked me how I was doing, and I told her I was fine, that work was keeping me busy as always, and then she asked me if Laura was enjoying her trip, and I said of course she was, that she had been looking forward to this conference for weeks, that it was good for her to get away and network with other marketing consultants and come back with fresh ideas. Nina tilted her head slightly, and the smile shifted into something I could not quite read, something that looked almost like pity, and she said that was funny because she had just been wondering why Laura had told her they were traveling together when clearly they were not. I felt the floor tilt for just a second, the way it does when you miss a step on a staircase and your body has to recalculate where the ground is, and I asked her what she meant, keeping my voice steady the way I had been trained to do when everything inside you is screaming to react. She took a step closer, close enough that I could see the way her eyes were watching mine, searching for something. And she said that Laura had told her she was going to a conference with a friend, that she had even mentioned Nina's name specifically, but Nina had not gone anywhere, had been teaching yoga classes all week, and when she saw Laura's Instagram story from some resort 200 miles away, she had assumed Laura had changed her plans and gone with someone else instead. I nodded slowly, keeping my face blank, keeping my breathing even, and I told Nina that Laura must have gotten her wires crossed, that she had probably mentioned Nina in passing and then ended up going with a work colleague. That these things happen when you are juggling a busy schedule? Nina looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the decision being made about whether to push further or let it go. And then she leaned in and lowered her voice and said that she did not think it was a work colleague, that she had seen the way Laura had been acting lately, distant and distracted and always checking her phone, and that when Nina had asked her directly if everything was okay, Laura had smiled and said everything was perfect, but Nina had not believed her. She told me that Laura was traveling with another man, that she did not know who he was, but she knew it was not me, and then she paused and asked me if I wanted to have dinner with her that night, just the 2 of us, to talk or not talk, whatever I needed. I thanked her and told her I had work to finish, that I appreciated her concern, but I was sure there was a reasonable explanation, and then I walked away before she could say anything else, before the cracks in my voice could give me away. I took the stairs down to the basement level where my office was, a windowless room filled with filing cabinets and maintenance logs and the smell of oil and dust, and I locked the door behind me and stood there in the silence, letting the words sink in, letting the truth reshape itself around me. Laura was traveling with another man. Laura had lied to me about who she was with. Laura had used Nina's name as cover, had built an entire story that was designed to keep me from asking questions. And I had believed her because I had wanted to believe her, because believing her was easier than admitting that I had missed something, that the man who saw everything had been blind to the one thing that mattered most. I sat down at my desk and opened the bottom drawer where I kept my personal files, the things that had nothing to do with the building and everything to do with the life I thought I was living, and I pulled out a blank notebook and wrote Day 1 at the top of the first page. I did not write about how I felt, did not waste ink on anger or betrayal or the sick weight that was settling in my chest, because feelings were not evidence, feelings were not proof, and proof was the only thing that would matter when this was over. I wrote down Nina's name and the time and the location, wrote down exactly what she had said and exactly how I had responded. And then I opened my laptop and logged into the shared cloud account that Laura and I used for family photos, the one that auto-uploaded every picture either of us took so we would never lose a memory, so we would always have a record of where we had been and who we had been with. I scrolled through the most recent uploads, past the photos of us at her sister's birthday party last month, past the shots of the new coffee table we had argued about for an hour before finally agreeing to buy, and then I found them. A series of photos from this morning taken at a resort I had never heard of. Photos of a poolside view and a breakfast spread and a sunset that I had not watched with her. I clicked on the first photo and checked the metadata, the little string of numbers and timestamps that most people never look at, that most people do not even know exists, and I saw that it had been taken at 10:17 this morning, 206 miles from our apartment, in a town I had never visited. I took a screenshot of the metadata screen, saved it to a folder I labeled Evidence, and then I went back to the shared account and checked the rideshare history, the one linked to the credit card that I paid every month, the one Laura used when she needed a ride to the airport or a client meeting. There it was, a charge from this morning, 9:03, airport pickup, $87. Destination matching the exact address of the resort in the photos. I took another screenshot, saved it to the same folder, and then I sat back and stared at the screen, at the two pieces of proof that told me everything I needed to know and nothing I wanted to believe. Laura had lied about where she was going, had used my money to get there, had documented the whole thing with photos that she thought I would never check, and now I had the beginning of a trail, the first two breadcrumbs in what I knew would be a long walk toward the truth. I closed the laptop and picked up my pen and wrote down the evidence in the notebook, wrote it in clean block letters so there could be no confusion later, so when the time came to show someone else what I had found, they would be able to read it without effort. Cloud album metadata, resort photos, Friday 10/17, rideshare receipt, airport pickup, Friday 9:03, $87, shared account. I underlined the last two words because they mattered, because it meant she had not even tried to hide it, had not even thought I would be looking, and that told me something important about how she saw me, about how little she thought I was paying attention. I locked the notebook in the desk drawer, turned off the lights, and walked back upstairs to the lobby, where the evening shift doorman was just arriving, where the building was settling into its nightly rhythm, and I realized that everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, that nothing had changed except me, except the way I saw the world now, except the fact that I had just opened a case file on my own marriage and I was not going to close it until I knew every detail, every lie, every moment she thought I would never find. I woke up at 5:30 on Friday morning with the kind of clarity that only comes when you have spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in your head, building and rebuilding the architecture of someone else's lies until you understand exactly how they were constructed, and exactly where the weak points are. Laura was still asleep beside me, her breathing slow and even, one arm draped across the pillow where my head had been before I gave up on sleep entirely, and I looked at her in the gray pre-dawn light filtering through the curtains and tried to reconcile the woman I had married with the woman who had lied to my face, who had kissed me goodbye yesterday morning and told me she would miss me, who had promised to text me when she landed safely, and who had done exactly that, had sent me a cheerful message with a heart emoji while she was standing in a resort lobby 200 miles away with someone who was not me. I got out of bed carefully, moving with the kind of precision I had learned in the military, the kind that lets you extract yourself from a situation without leaving a trace, and I went down to my office in the basement where the files were waiting, where the evidence I had started gathering last night was sitting in a locked drawer like a bomb that had not yet gone off. I made coffee in the small machine I kept on the shelf beside the maintenance logs, the cheap kind that tastes like burnt water but keeps you awake when you need to be awake, and I opened my laptop and logged back into the shared cloud account, telling myself that I was going to approach this the same way I approached every problem in this building, methodically and without emotion, cataloging each piece of information and letting the pattern reveal itself without forcing it into a shape that might not be true. The cloud album loaded slowly, the spinning circle on the screen mocking me with its leisurely pace, and then the photos appeared in neat rows, organized by date and time, each one a small window into a moment that I had not been part of, a moment that Laura had chosen to document and upload without thinking about the fact that I could see it too. I scrolled past the poolside shot from yesterday, past the breakfast table with its artfully arranged pastries and fresh fruit, and I found 3 more photos that had been uploaded this morning while I was lying awake in bed. Photos of a hiking trail with morning mist clinging to the trees, a coffee cup with a resort logo printed on the side, and a view from what looked like a balcony overlooking a lake that shimmered gold in the early sunlight. I clicked on each photo and checked the metadata, writing down the timestamps and location coordinates in the notebook I had brought with me, and I noticed that the photos had been taken between 7:15 and 7:45 this morning, which meant Laura had been awake early, had been out walking the grounds with someone, had been living an entire parallel morning while I was down here in the basement drinking bitter coffee and trying to make sense of the woman she had become. I took screenshots of each photo's metadata screen, labeling them carefully in the folder I had created, and then I opened a new browser tab and pulled up our shared bank account, the one we used for household expenses and bills, the one that was supposed to make our lives easier by consolidating everything in one place so we did not have to ask each other for money or keep track of who paid for what. I scrolled through the recent transactions, past the grocery store charge from last week, past the utility payment and the internet bill, and then I found it. The rideshare charge from yesterday morning that I had seen last night, $87 for an airport pickup that I had not requested and Laura had not mentioned. I clicked on the transaction details and saw that the pickup location was our building's address and the drop-off location was the resort, the exact same resort where the photos had been taken, and I realized that she had not even tried to use a different payment method, had not even thought to cover her tracks because she had assumed I would never look, had assumed I was too busy or too trusting or too stupid to check. I took another screenshot and saved it to the evidence folder, and then I kept scrolling through the account history, looking for anything else that might fit the pattern, any other charges that did not make sense or trips that I had not known about, and I found 2 more rideshare charges from the past month, both on Friday mornings, both going to addresses I did not recognize, both costing between $60 and $90. I wrote down the dates and amounts in my notebook, circling them so I would remember to cross-reference them later with the cloud photos, with Laura's calendar, with anything else I could find that would help me build a timeline of when this had started and how long it had been going on. I felt my hands tighten around the pen as I wrote, felt the anger trying to claw its way up through my chest and into my throat, but I forced it back down because anger was not useful right now. Anger was a distraction, and I needed to stay focused on the work, on the evidence, on the slow and patient accumulation of facts that would eventually tell me everything I needed to know. I closed the bank account tab and opened the shared calendar app, the one Laura and I used to keep track of appointments and meetings and social events, the one that was supposed to help us coordinate our lives so we did not double book ourselves or forget important dates. I scrolled back through the past month, looking at the entries Laura had added, and I saw a pattern emerging, a series of Friday entries marked client meeting, all day, or conference prep, out of office, or marketing workshop, remote location, all of them conveniently vague, all of them giving her an excuse to be unreachable for hours at a time, all of them lining up perfectly with the rideshare charges I had just found in the bank account. I took screenshots of the calendar entries, saved them to the evidence folder, and then I sat back and stared at the screen, at the careful construction of lies that Laura had built over the course of weeks or maybe months, at the systematic way she had created a false narrative that I was supposed to accept without question because I trusted her, because I loved her, because I had no reason to believe she would ever do something like this. I pulled up the metadata from the resort photos again and looked at the location coordinates, and then I opened a mapping application and entered the coordinates to see exactly where the resort was, what it looked like, whether it was the kind of place someone might go for a legitimate work conference, or whether it was the kind of place you went when you wanted privacy, when you wanted to disappear for a weekend with someone who was not your spouse. The map loaded and showed me a small luxury resort nestled in the hills, the kind of place with spa packages and couples massage and private balconies overlooking the lake, the kind of place that advertised itself as a romantic getaway. And I felt something cold and heavy settle in my stomach as I realized that this was not a conference, had never been a conference, was nothing but a carefully planned trip that Laura had taken with someone else while I was here in the building, fixing smoke detectors and filing maintenance logs and believing every word she had told me. I took one more screenshot, this one of the resort's homepage with its tagline about rekindling romance and escaping the everyday, and I saved it to the evidence folder, and then I created a simple spreadsheet with 3 columns labeled date, location, and payment, and I started filling in the rows with everything I had found so far. Friday the 8th, unknown address, $63. Friday the 15th, unknown address, $91. Friday the 22nd, resort address, $87. I added a 4th column labeled Notes and wrote Client Meeting, Calendar next to the first date, Marketing Workshop, Calendar next to the second date, and Conference, told me directly, next to the third date, and I sat there looking at the spreadsheet, at the clean and undeniable pattern of deception that I had constructed from nothing but timestamps and transaction records and the digital breadcrumbs that Laura had left behind because she thought no one was paying attention. I saved the spreadsheet, backed it up to a secure folder that only I could access, and then I printed a copy on the small printer I kept in my office for maintenance reports and incident logs. And I folded the printed page carefully and slipped it into the evidence notebook along with all the handwritten notes I had made. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was almost 7, that I had been down here for more than an hour, that Laura would be waking up soon if she had not already, and I realized that I was going to have to go back upstairs and act like everything was normal, like I had not just spent the past hour dismantling the foundation of our marriage one screenshot at a time, like I was still the trusting husband who believed every lie she told me. I closed the laptop, locked the evidence notebook back in the desk drawer, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet of the basement office, letting myself feel the weight of what I had discovered, letting myself acknowledge that this was real, that this was happening, that the woman I had married was not the woman I thought she was, and then I turned off the lights and went back upstairs to start the day, to smile and nod and play the role I needed to play until I had gathered enough evidence to end this on my terms, not hers. The building was starting to wake up by the time I came back upstairs from the basement office, the sounds of morning routines filtering through the walls and floors, the hum of coffee makers and the rush of showers and the muffled voices of people getting ready to face another day, and I moved through the hallways with my toolkit in hand, playing the part I had played for 6 years, the superintendent who was always working, always fixing something, always available to solve whatever small crisis might arise. I had learned a long time ago that people stop seeing you when you become part of the scenery, when you are just the guy in the maintenance uniform who shows up to replace the air filters or tighten a loose doorknob, and that invisibility had always been useful in this job, had always given me access to information that people did not realize they were sharing, but now it felt different. Now it felt like a weapon I could use, like a way of moving through the world without anyone realizing what I was really doing or what I was really looking for. I took the stairs up to the lobby level and found Mr. Caruso standing behind the front desk, sorting through the morning mail delivery with the kind of methodical patience that comes from doing the same task every day for 20 years. And I nodded to him as I crossed the marble floor, and he looked up and gave me the same nod he always gave me, the silent acknowledgement that passed between two men who worked while everyone else slept, who kept the machinery of the building running while the residents lived their lives without ever thinking about what it took to make everything work. Caruso was on the night shift most of the time, which meant he saw things that the daytime staff missed, saw who came home late and who left early, and who had visitors at hours that did not quite match the stories they told their neighbors. And I had always respected his discretion, his ability to see everything and say nothing unless someone gave him a reason to speak. I walked over to the desk and asked him how the night had been, and he shrugged and said it had been quiet except for a noise complaint on the 6th floor around midnight that had resolved itself before he needed to call anyone. And then he looked at me with the kind of expression that suggested he had something else on his mind, something he was deciding whether or not to mention. I waited, keeping my face neutral, keeping my hands busy with the toolkit so it looked like I was just making conversation while I worked, and after a moment he leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice and asked me if everything was okay with my apartment, if there had been any problems I needed him to know about, any issues with visitors or noise or anything else that might require his attention. I felt something cold move through my chest, a flicker of recognition that Caruso was trying to tell me something without actually saying it, that he had seen something or heard something that he thought I should know, and I kept my voice steady and asked him what he meant, what kind of problems he was talking about. He hesitated for a moment, his hands still moving through the stack of mail, and then he said that he had noticed a pattern over the past few weeks, that there had been a male visitor coming to my apartment on Friday nights, usually arriving around 11 and leaving around 2 in the morning, and that he had logged it in the visitor book the way he was supposed to, but had not thought much of it until now. Until I was standing there asking questions with a look on my face that suggested I did not know anything about these visits. I felt the floor shift under me again. The same sensation I had felt when Nina told me about Laura's trip. The sudden realization that the world I thought I understood was built on foundations that were crumbling faster than I could shore them up. And I asked Caruso if he remembered what the visitor looked like, if he had gotten a name, if there was anything in the logs that might help me understand who this person was and why he had been coming to my apartment. While I was working late, or sleeping, or doing anything other than paying attention to what was happening in my own home. Caruso pulled out the visitor logbook from under the desk, a thick binder with pages that went back months, and he flipped through it until he found the entries he was looking for, and he turned the book around so I could see it. And there they were, 3 entries over the past month, all on Friday nights, all listing my apartment number, all signed by someone who had written guest of resident in the name column without providing any actual identification. I looked at the dates and saw that they matched the rideshare charges I had found in the bank account, matched the calendar entries Laura had created to explain why she would be out late or unreachable, and I realized that this was not just about a weekend trip to a resort, not just about a single lie that I could confront and maybe understand, but about a pattern of deception that had been happening in my own home, in the place where I was supposed to feel safe, where I was supposed to be able to trust that the person I loved was not inviting someone else into our bed while I was down in the basement or out on a late-night repair call. I asked Caruso if he would be willing to write down what he had just told me, just a simple one-sentence summary that I could keep for my records, and he looked at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from concern to something that looked almost like sympathy, and then he pulled out a piece of paper from the desk drawer and wrote in his careful block letters, "Male visitor to apartment 1012, 11 p.m. to 2 a.m., 3 Fridays, logged as guest of resident," and he signed his name at the bottom and dated it and slid it across the desk to me. I thanked him and told him I appreciated his discretion, that this was a personal matter and I would handle it quietly, and he nodded and said that he understood, that he had been working in buildings long enough to know when to speak up and when to stay silent, and that if I needed anything else from him, anything at all, I should just ask. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket, and I left the lobby and went back down to my office. And I added Caruso's note to the evidence folder, writing in my notebook that I now had confirmation of a pattern, that the trips Laura had been taking were not the whole story, that there had been someone coming here, to our home, while I was busy keeping the building running, while I was trusting her to be faithful, while I was living in a version of reality that no longer existed. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop again, and I went back to the building's security system, the one that tracked keycard access to the main entrances and the elevator, and I pulled up the logs for the past month, looking for entries that matched the times Caruso had written in the visitor book, looking for any clue about who this person was and how he had been getting into the building. The security logs were dense and hard to read, full of codes and timestamps that only made sense if you knew the system, but I had been working with these logs for years, had used them to track down package thieves and unauthorized contractors and residents who had lost their keycards and needed replacements, and I knew how to find what I was looking for if I was patient enough. I filtered the logs by date and time, narrowing the search to Friday nights between 10:30 and 11:30, and I found a series of entries that all showed the same keycard number, a card that was registered to someone in the building, someone who had legitimate access, someone who would not raise any red flags with the overnight security staff because they were supposed to be here. I cross-referenced the keycard number with the building's resident database, and I felt my stomach drop when I saw the name that came up, when I realized that the person who had been visiting my apartment, who had been spending hours there while I was working, who had been part of this pattern of lies and deception, was Victor Hale, the president of the Homeowners Association, a man I saw in the hallways and the elevators and the lobby almost every day, a man I had nodded to and exchanged pleasantries with and never once suspected of being the person who was destroying my marriage from the inside. I sat there staring at the screen, at Victor's name glowing in the cold blue light of the monitor, and I felt something shift inside me, something that had been uncertain and confused and grasping for answers suddenly snapping into focus with a clarity that was almost painful. This was not just an affair, not just a betrayal, but a calculated pattern of deception that involved someone who had power in this building, someone who could edit incident reports and control access logs and shape the narrative in ways that I was only beginning to understand. And I realized that if I was going to bring this to light, if I was going to make sure that Victor and Laura faced consequences for what they had done, I was going to need more than just screenshots and rideshare receipts and a note from a night doorman. I was going to need to be smarter than both of them, more patient than both of them, more willing to wait and watch and gather evidence until I had built a case that was so airtight, so undeniable, that there would be no way for them to talk their way out of it, no way for them to spin the story or claim it was all a misunderstanding or make me look like the paranoid husband who had imagined the whole thing. I closed the laptop and locked the evidence folder and the notebook back in the desk drawer, and I stood up and walked to the small window that looked out onto the basement parking garage, and I watched the cars coming and going, the residents leaving for work or coming back from the gym, all of them living their normal lives while mine was falling apart in slow motion. And I made myself a promise that I would not confront Victor, would not confront Laura, would not say a single word until I had everything I needed, until I had turned their lies into a weapon they could not defend against. I spent the rest of Saturday morning moving through the building like a ghost, checking maintenance logs and replacing air filters and responding to tenant requests with the same calm efficiency I always brought to the job, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. running through the implications of what I had discovered, trying to map out the full scope of Victor Hale's involvement and figure out exactly how deep this betrayal went. Victor was not just another resident having an affair with someone's wife. He was the president of the Homeowners Association, which meant he had access to systems and records that most people in the building never thought about. Access that could be used to cover tracks or erase evidence or rewrite the story of what had happened on any given night. I had worked with Victor on dozens of building issues over the years, had sat in budget meetings and compliance reviews and listened to him talk about transparency and accountability and the importance of maintaining standards. And now I realized that all of that had been performance, that the man who lectured residents about following the rules was the same man who had been sneaking into my apartment on Friday nights while I was down in the basement filing incident reports that he could edit or delete whenever he wanted. I went back to my office and pulled up the building's incident report archive, the digital database where every complaint and maintenance issue and security concern was supposed to be logged for insurance purposes and liability protection, and I started searching for any reports that involved my floor, my apartment, or any mention of Victor's name in connection with the 10th floor where I lived. The archive was supposed to be comprehensive, a complete record of everything that had happened in the building over the past 5 years, but as I scrolled through the entries, I noticed gaps, missing report numbers, dates that should have had entries but instead showed nothing, as if someone had gone in and systematically removed anything that might raise questions or create a pattern that could be traced back to a specific person. I checked the audit log, the meta record that was supposed to track who accessed the database and when, and I saw Victor's username appearing over and over again, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes on weekends, always with the same action code that indicated he had opened a report, viewed it, and then either edited it or deleted it entirely. I found one report that he had missed, a draft that had been filed by the previous night doorman about 6 weeks ago, a simple noise complaint about voices in the hallway outside my apartment around midnight on a Friday, a report that had been marked as resolved without any follow-up notes or explanations, and I realized that this was the kind of thing Victor had been cleaning up, the small traces of evidence that might have accumulated over time if anyone had been paying attention, if anyone had bothered to connect the dots between a noise complaint and a pattern of late-night visits, and the fact that the HOA president seemed to have a special interest in making sure certain things did not get recorded in the official logs. I took a screenshot of the draft report, saved it to my evidence folder, and then I went back through the audit log and documented every instance where Victor had accessed the incident report system outside of normal business hours, every time he had opened a report related to the 10th floor, every time he had used his administrative privileges to shape the narrative in ways that served his interests rather than the building's. I printed out the audit log summary and added it to the evidence notebook, and then I sat back and thought about what this meant, about the fact that Victor was not just having an affair, but was actively using his position of power to cover it up, to erase the evidence, to make sure that no one would ever be able to piece together what had been happening under everyone's noses. This was not just about betrayal anymore. It was about abuse of authority, about a board member violating the trust that residents had placed in him, about someone who had taken an oath to act in the best interests of the community, and had instead used his access and his influence to protect himself while he destroyed someone else's marriage. I realized that this gave me leverage, that if I could document the pattern of Victor's behavior, if I could show that he had been editing logs and deleting reports and covering his tracks, then I could take this to the board, could force them to see that their president was not the upstanding leader they thought he was, but someone who had compromised the integrity of the entire system for his own selfish purposes. I was sitting there staring at the printed audit log when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my office, the distinct sound of dress shoes on concrete, and I looked up just as Victor Hale appeared in the doorway, his hand resting casually on the frame, his expression somewhere between curious and amused, as if he had just stumbled across something mildly interesting and wanted to see what I was up to. He asked me if I was working on anything urgent, if there were any building issues he should know about, and I felt my pulse spike but kept my face neutral, kept my voice steady, and told him I was just catching up on maintenance logs, nothing that required his attention. He stepped into the office without being invited, his eyes scanning the desk, the filing cabinets, the wall where I had pinned up work orders and compliance notices, and I resisted the urge to close the laptop or cover the papers on my desk because that would have signaled that I had something to hide, that I was doing something other than the routine work he expected to see. He made some comment about how dedicated I was, how the building was lucky to have someone who took the job so seriously, and I nodded and thanked him and waited for him to leave, but instead he lingered, his gaze drifting back to the desk, to the stack of papers I had been reviewing, and he asked me if everything was okay at home, if Laura was enjoying her trip, if I was managing all right on my own for the weekend. I felt something cold and sharp move through my chest, the realization that he was testing me, that he wanted to see if I knew anything, if I suspected anything, if I was the kind of husband who checked up on his wife or the kind who trusted her without question, and I forced myself to smile and told him that everything was fine, that Laura was having a great time at her conference, that I was looking forward to hearing all about it when she got back tomorrow. He smiled back, a smile that did not reach his eyes, and he said that was good, that it was important for couples to have their own space sometimes, to pursue their own interests and not get too wrapped up in each other's lives. And I nodded again and agreed with him, even though every word felt like glass in my mouth, even though I wanted nothing more than to tell him that I knew exactly what he had been doing, that I had the logs and the screenshots and the witness statements, that I was going to make sure he paid for every lie he had told and every report he had deleted, and every night he had spent in my apartment while I was working to keep this building running. But I said nothing, just kept nodding and smiling and playing the role of the oblivious husband, because I knew that confronting him now would be a mistake, would give him time to cover his tracks or spin the story or use his position to turn the board against me before I had a chance to present the evidence in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. He finally left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, and I sat there in the silence of my office, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the evidence notebook and wrote down the date and time of the encounter, wrote down exactly what Victor had said and how he had said it, the way he had asked about Laura, the way he had smiled when he mentioned couples needing space, the casual cruelty of a man who thought he was untouchable because he had power and access and the ability to rewrite the official record whenever it suited him. I realized that this was personal for him now, that he saw me as a potential threat, that he was trying to assess whether I was someone he needed to worry about or someone he could continue to manipulate and deceive, and I knew that from this point forward I would have to be even more careful, even more methodical, even more invisible than I had been before. Because Victor Hale was not just a cheating lover, he was a man who controlled the levers of power in this building, and if I was going to bring him down, I was going to have to be smarter and more patient than he could ever imagine. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of weight that comes from knowing you are about to cross a line you cannot uncross, about to set events in motion that will change everything, regardless of how carefully you have planned or how much evidence you have gathered. And I drove to my in-laws' house for the weekly family dinner with the printed timeline folded in my jacket pocket, the rideshare receipt tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve, and a copy of the shared calendar entries that showed every lie Laura had constructed over the past month. My mother-in-law had been hosting these dinners for as long as I had been part of the family. Sunday evenings at 6 o'clock with pot roast and mashed potatoes and the kind of comfortable routine that made you feel like you belonged somewhere, like you were part of something stable and permanent. And I had always looked forward to these gatherings, had always appreciated the way Laura's parents treated me like a son rather than just someone their daughter had married, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like I was walking into an ambush of my own design, and I knew that by the time I left this house, nothing would ever be the same between any of us. Laura was already there when I arrived, sitting in the living room with her sister and laughing about something I had not heard, and she looked up when I walked in and smiled at me with the same warmth she always showed in front of her family, the same easy affection that had always made me believe we were solid, that whatever problems we might have were small and manageable, and nothing that could threaten the foundation of what we had built together. I smiled back and kissed her on the cheek and sat down beside her, and I made small talk with her father about a plumbing issue he was having in his basement, and I listened to her mother talk about the church fundraiser she was organizing, and I played the role I had always played in this house, the reliable son-in-law who fixed things and showed up on time and never caused drama or made anyone uncomfortable, but the whole time I could feel the papers in my pocket pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat, like a reminder that I was carrying evidence that would shatter the illusion of normalcy we were all pretending to maintain. Dinner was served at 6:30, and we all took our usual seats around the table, Laura's father at the head, her mother to his right, Laura and I on one side, and her sister across from us. And the conversation flowed the way it always did, stories about work and neighbors and plans for the upcoming holidays, and Laura told everyone about her conference, about the keynote speaker who had talked about innovative marketing strategies, about the networking sessions where she had met consultants from 3 different states, about how exhausting but rewarding the whole experience had been. And I sat there listening to her lie with such ease, such confidence, such complete commitment to the fiction she had created, and I realized that this was not the first time she had done this, that she had been practicing this performance for weeks or maybe months, that every detail had been rehearsed and polished until it sounded natural, until even I might have believed it if I had not seen the evidence with my own eyes. I waited until she had finished her story, until her mother had asked a follow-up question about one of the sessions, and Laura had answered with the kind of specificity that made it all sound real. And then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the rideshare receipt and placed it on the table beside Laura's plate, the plastic sleeve catching the light from the chandelier overhead, the timestamp and destination address clearly visible to anyone who cared to look. The conversation stopped immediately, the kind of silence that happens when everyone at the table realizes something significant has just occurred, but no one quite understands what it means yet. And Laura looked down at the receipt and then up at me, her expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. And I watched her try to calculate what I knew, how much I had figured out, whether this was a test she could still pass or a trap she had already walked into. Her mother leaned forward and asked what the receipt was for, her voice still light and curious, as if she thought this might be some kind of joke or misunderstanding, and I told her it was a rideshare charge from Friday morning, a charge for an airport pickup that took Laura to a resort 200 miles away, a resort that did not host marketing conferences but instead advertised itself as a romantic getaway for couples looking to escape their everyday lives. Laura opened her mouth to say something, to offer an explanation or a denial or whatever story she had prepared for a moment like this, but I did not give her the chance, did not let her spin the narrative the way she had been spinning it for weeks, and instead I pulled out the printed timeline and unfolded it on the table, showing the dates and locations and payment amounts, showing the pattern of Friday trips and calendar entries and lies that had been stacking up like bricks in a wall that was finally about to collapse. Her father picked up the timeline and read it slowly, his expression hardening with each line, and her mother looked at Laura with the kind of disappointment that only a parent can deliver, the kind that cuts deeper than anger or accusations ever could, and Laura's sister just sat there staring at the papers on the table as if she could not quite believe what she was seeing, as if the person sitting across from her was not the same sister she had known her entire life. Laura tried to explain, tried to say that it was not what it looked like, that there were things I did not understand, that the calendar entries were legitimate work obligations, and the resort was just a place where she had gone to clear her head and think about our marriage. But her voice was shaking, and her hands were trembling, and everyone at the table could see that she was lying, that the evidence was right there in front of them, and no amount of explanation was going to make it disappear or turn it into something innocent. Her mother asked her directly if she had been having an affair, if she had been lying to all of them, if she had been using family dinners and church events and all the other rituals of their shared life as cover for something that betrayed everything they believed in. And Laura looked at me with something that might have been pleading or might have been anger, and she said that I was making a scene, that this was not the time or place for this conversation, that we should talk about it privately like adults instead of dragging her family into our problems. I folded the timeline and put it back in my pocket, and I stood up from the table and told her that I had tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, had tried to find some explanation that made sense, but the evidence was clear and I was not going to pretend anymore, was not going to sit through another dinner listening to her lies while she smiled and played the role of the devoted wife. I walked out of the dining room without looking back, left the house and got in my car and drove back to the building, and I did not answer my phone when Laura called 5 minutes later, did not respond to the text messages from her sister asking me to come back and talk this through, did not engage with any of the attempts to smooth things over or make me feel like I was overreacting or being unreasonable, because I knew that this was just the beginning, that the family dinner had been the first public reveal, the first crack in the facade that Laura and Victor had built, and that everything that came next would be even more difficult, even more painful, even more necessary if I was going to make sure that the truth came out, and that both of them faced real consequences for what they had done. Monday morning came with a heaviness that settled into my bones, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from the constant effort of maintaining control, of staying calm when every instinct tells you to burn everything down and confront the people who have betrayed you. And I went through my morning routine on autopilot, showering and dressing and making coffee in the small kitchen that suddenly felt too quiet, too empty, too full of memories of a life that had turned out to be built on lies. Laura had not come home the night before, had stayed with her parents or her sister, or maybe even with Victor for all I knew, and I had spent the hours between midnight and dawn sitting at my desk in the basement office adding notes to the evidence ledger, cross-referencing timestamps, building the kind of airtight case that would leave no room for doubt or interpretation when the time came to present it to people who mattered, people who had the power to enforce consequences that Laura and Victor could not talk their way out of, or smooth over with apologies and explanations. I knew that walking out of the family dinner had been a risk, that it had tipped my hand and let Laura know that I was not just suspicious, but certain, that I had evidence and was willing to use it, and I knew that she would be scrambling now, calling Victor, trying to figure out what I knew and what I could prove and what story they could construct that would minimize the damage or shift the blame or make me look like the unstable husband who had jumped to conclusions without giving her a chance to explain. But I also knew that leaving the way I did, with nothing but the timeline and the receipt and the cold silence that came from refusing to engage with her lies, had given me something more valuable than surprise. It had given me the moral high ground, had made it clear to her family that I was not the one who had broken our marriage, that I was not the one who needed to explain myself or justify my actions, and that whatever came next would be a direct result of choices she had made, not accusations I had invented. I went down to the lobby around 7 and found Mr. Caruso finishing up his night shift, preparing to hand over the desk to the morning staff, and he looked up when I approached, and I could see in his expression that he had heard something. That word had already started to spread through the building in the way it always does when people sense that something significant has happened, when the carefully maintained facade of normalcy begins to crack and the gossip starts flowing through the ELEV. Tuesday morning arrived with a strange clarity, the kind that comes when you have moved past shock and anger and settled into something colder and more focused, something that feels less like emotion and more like purpose. And I sat in my basement office drafting an email that would change the trajectory of everything I had been building toward. An email that would take the evidence out of my private files and put it into the hands of people who had the authority to act on it, people who could not ignore it or dismiss it, or pretend it was just a domestic dispute that had nothing to do with the building or its governance. The email was addressed to Ms. Patel, the board secretary, a woman I had worked with on dozens of compliance issues over the years. A woman whose reputation for precision and fairness was known throughout the building, and I knew that if anyone would take the evidence seriously, if anyone would follow the proper procedures and ensure that the complaint was handled by the book rather than swept under the rug, it would be her. I wrote the email carefully, keeping the language formal and factual, avoiding any hint of personal grievance or emotional language that might make it seem like I was acting out of spite rather than legitimate concern about a board member abusing his position, and I cited the specific sections of the Homeowners Association bylaws that prohibited board members from using their access privileges for personal purposes, from editing or deleting incident reports without proper authorization, from engaging in conduct that compromised the integrity of the building's record-keeping systems. I attached the audit log summary showing Victor's late-night access to the incident report database, attached the screenshot of the deleted noise complaint draft, attached the timeline of keycard entries that matched the visitor log entries that Caruso had documented, and I wrote in the closing paragraph that I was filing this complaint not as a resident seeking personal revenge, but as an employee of the building who had a professional obligation to report potential violations of the governing documents, violations that affected the safety and security of every resident who trusted that the systems in place were being used appropriately and transparently. I read the email 3 times before sending it, checking every sentence for clarity and tone, making sure that nothing I had written could be used against me later, that there was no opening for Victor or his allies on the board to claim that I was acting inappropriately, or that my complaint was motivated by personal animus rather than legitimate professional concern, and then I attached the evidence files, double-checked the recipient address, and clicked send. And I watched the message disappear from my outbox and felt a strange sense of relief mixed with dread. The knowledge that I had just set something in motion that could not be stopped or reversed, that from this moment forward the complaint would have its own life, its own momentum, its own consequences that would unfold according to the bylaws and procedures that governed how the board was supposed to operate. Ms. Patel responded within an hour, a brief acknowledgement that she had received the complaint and would be reviewing the attached materials, that she would need to consult with the board chair about the proper procedure for handling an ethics complaint against a sitting board member, and that I should expect to hear back from her within 48 hours regarding next steps. I saved her response to the evidence folder, noted the time and date in my ledger, and then I went back to work, responding to maintenance requests and checking the building systems and moving through the hallways with the same calm efficiency I always brought to the job. But underneath the routine, I could feel the tension building, could feel the weight of what I had just done settling into my bones, and I knew that Victor would find out about the complaint soon if he had not already, that Ms. Patel would be required to notify him as part of the due process procedures, and that once he realized that I had not just walked away from the affair but had turned it into an official board matter, he would either panic and make mistakes, or he would come after me with everything he had, trying to discredit me or intimidate me or find some way to make the complaint disappear before it could do any real damage to his reputation or his position. I was in the 3rd floor utility closet replacing a water heater valve when my phone buzzed with a text message, and I pulled it out expecting to see something work-related, another maintenance request or a question from one of the residents, but instead I saw Victor's name on the screen, a message that was short and direct and designed to sound casual even though the subtext was anything but, asking if I had a few minutes to talk about a building matter, suggesting we meet in his office on the 14th floor in an hour, phrasing it as a request but making it clear that he expected me to show up. I stared at the message for a long moment, considering my options, knowing that ignoring it would only make him more suspicious, more aggressive, more likely to use his position to create problems for me, but also knowing that meeting with him alone, in his office, in a space where he controlled the environment and the narrative, was a risk that could backfire if he was recording the conversation or trying to get me to say something that could be used against me later. I decided to respond, but on my own terms, texting back that I was in the middle of a repair job and could not leave the building systems unattended, but that I would be available to meet in the lobby in 2 hours if it was urgent, and that if it was not urgent, we could schedule something for later in the week when I had more flexibility in my schedule. The response came back almost immediately, a single word, lobby, followed by a time, and I knew that he had taken the bait, had agreed to meet in a public space where there would be witnesses, where Caruso or one of the other staff members might overhear parts of the conversation, where he could not corner me or threaten me or try to intimidate me without risking someone else seeing or hearing what he was doing. I finished the valve replacement, cleaned up my tools, and went back down to my office to prepare for the meeting, to review my notes and remind myself of exactly what I could say and what I needed to keep to myself, to make sure that I did not give him any ammunition he could use to turn this around on me or make it look like I was the one acting inappropriately. 2 hours later, I walked into the lobby and found Victor standing near the front desk, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp and assessing, and I could see that he was trying to read me, trying to figure out if I knew about the complaint yet, if I was the one who had filed it, if I was someone he needed to worry about, or someone he could still manipulate into backing down. I walked over and asked him what he needed to talk about, keeping my voice neutral and professional, and he suggested we step outside for a moment, away from the desk where Caruso was sorting mail and pretending not to listen, and I shook my head and told him that whatever he needed to say could be said right here, that I had work to get back to and did not have time for a long conversation. And I watched his jaw tighten slightly, watched him recalculate his approach, watched him realize that I was not going to make this easy for him, that whatever game he had been playing was about to get a lot more complicated. Victor looked at me for a long moment, his expression hovering somewhere between irritation and calculation, and then he said that he had heard some concerning rumors about me spreading false information regarding board members, that he wanted to give me a chance to clear the air before things escalated into something that could affect my employment, and I felt a cold spike of anger move through my chest at the casual way he was threatening my job, at the assumption that he could intimidate me into backing down just by suggesting that my livelihood was at stake. I kept my face neutral and asked him what rumors he was referring to, what false information he thought I had been spreading, and I made sure my voice carried just enough to reach Caruso at the desk, to ensure that there would be at least one witness to whatever Victor said next, one person who could verify that I had not initiated this confrontation and had not responded with anything other than professional courtesy and direct questions. He lowered his voice slightly, but not enough to make the conversation private, and he said that he understood I was going through a difficult time at home, that marital problems could make people act irrationally, that sometimes when we were hurting, we looked for someone to blame instead of taking responsibility for our own failures. And I realized that he was trying to spin the narrative before it could take shape, trying to plant the seed that anything I said about him was just the bitter reaction of a husband who could not accept that his marriage had failed, that I was unstable and unreliable and motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate concern. I let him finish his little speech, let him hang himself with his own words, while Caruso stood 10 feet away pretending to read the mail, but clearly listening to every syllable. And then I told Victor very calmly that I had not been spreading rumors, that I had filed a formal ethics complaint with the board secretary in accordance with the procedures outlined in the bylaws, and that if he had questions about the complaint or the evidence supporting it, he should direct those questions to Ms. Patel rather than confronting me in the lobby and making thinly veiled threats about my employment. The expression on his face shifted from condescension to something harder and more dangerous, and he took a step closer to me, close enough that I could see the muscle working in his jaw, close enough that anyone watching would recognize this as an aggressive move, an attempt to use physical proximity to intimidate. And he said in a low voice that I was making a serious mistake, that I had no idea what I was dealing with, that he had been running this building for 5 years and had the loyalty of the board and the residents, and that if I thought a few doctored screenshots and a paranoid conspiracy theory were going to take him down, I was even more deluded than he thought. I did not step back, did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me react to the intimidation, and I told him that the evidence was not doctored, that every document I had submitted to Ms. Patel could be independently verified through the building's own systems, and that if he had been using his position to edit incident reports and cover his tracks, that was a matter for the board to investigate, not for him to dismiss or threaten away. He stared at me for another moment, and I could see him weighing his options, trying to decide whether to escalate further or retreat and regroup, and then he said that we would see how this played out, that the board knew him and trusted him and would see through whatever game I was trying to play, and then he turned and walked toward the elevators without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor in a way that suggested he wanted everyone to hear him leaving, wanted to project confidence and control, even though I had just made it clear that I was not going to be bullied or silenced. I watched him go, watched the elevator doors close behind him, and then I turned and walked back toward Caruso at the desk, and he looked up at me with an expression that was carefully neutral, but not quite neutral enough to hide the fact that he had heard every word, that he knew exactly what had just happened, and that he was filing it away in whatever mental ledger he kept of building politics and resident drama. I asked him if he would be willing to write down what he had just witnessed, just a simple summary of the conversation and Victor's behavior. And he hesitated for only a second before pulling out another piece of paper and writing in his careful block letters that Victor Hale had approached me in the lobby, had made comments about my employment being at risk, had stepped into my personal space in an aggressive manner, and had threatened that I would regret filing a complaint against him. Caruso signed the note and dated it and slid it across the desk to me, and I thanked him and told him that I appreciated his willingness to document what he had seen, that it might become important later if Victor tried to claim that I had been the aggressor or that the confrontation had never happened, and Caruso just nodded and said that he had been working in buildings long enough to know when someone was abusing their power, and that Victor Hale had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, not after what Caruso had just witnessed. I went back down to my office and added Caruso's note to the evidence folder, and I sent a brief email to Ms. Patel informing her that Victor had confronted me in the lobby less than 2 hours after I had filed the complaint, that he had made threats regarding my employment and had attempted to intimidate me into withdrawing the complaint, and that I had a witness statement documenting the encounter if the board needed it for their investigation. Ms. Patel responded within minutes, her tone noticeably sharper than it had been in her previous email, stating that Victor's behavior was completely inappropriate and potentially constituted retaliation against a complainant, which was itself a violation of the bylaws, and that she would be escalating this matter to the board chair immediately and recommending that an emergency meeting be scheduled to address both the original complaint and the subsequent intimidation attempt. I sat back in my chair and felt something shift inside me, a sense that the machinery I had set in motion was now moving faster than I had anticipated, that Victor's decision to confront me had been a mistake that would cost him more than he realized, and that the board would now have to treat this not just as a personal dispute between two residents, but as a serious governance issue that threatened the integrity of the entire organization. I updated my evidence ledger with the details of the lobby confrontation, noted the time and date and Caruso's witness statement, and then I locked everything back in the desk drawer and went back to work, knowing that the next few days would determine whether Victor's power and influence would protect him, or whether the evidence and the procedures would be strong enough to bring him down, despite whatever alliances he had built over the years. Late that afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time with an email from Ms. Patel addressed to all board members and copied to me, informing everyone that an emergency board meeting had been scheduled for Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock in the clubhouse, that the purpose of the meeting was to review an ethics complaint filed against board president Victor Hale and to address allegations of retaliation and intimidation, and that all board members were required to attend, and that Victor would be given an opportunity to respond to the allegations, but would not be permitted to preside over the meeting or participate in any votes regarding his own conduct. I read the email twice, feeling the weight of what was coming, the knowledge that in less than 24 hours this would all be out in the open, that the evidence I had been gathering in secret would be presented to people who had the power to enforce real consequences, and that Victor would finally have to answer for what he had done, and not to me in a private confrontation, but to the board and the residents and the written procedures that he had spent years claiming to uphold. I forwarded the email to my personal account as a backup, saved a copy to the evidence folder, and then I sat there in the quiet of my office thinking about Laura, about whether she knew yet what was happening, whether Victor had called her in a panic after our lobby confrontation, whether she understood that the affair was no longer just a private betrayal, but a public scandal that would ripple through the building and beyond, touching everyone who had trusted either of them, everyone who had believed the stories they had told and the roles they had played. I wondered if she regretted it now, if she wished she had made different choices, or at least covered her tracks more carefully, but then I reminded myself that regret was not the same as accountability. That feeling bad about getting caught was not the same as taking responsibility for the harm you had caused, and that whatever happened at tomorrow's board meeting, whatever consequences Victor faced, it would only be the beginning of the justice I was determined to see carried out. Wednesday evening arrived with the kind of tension that makes every small sound feel amplified, every moment stretched thin with anticipation, and I walked into the clubhouse at 5:45 carrying nothing but a single manila folder containing copies of the evidence I had already submitted to Ms. Patel, knowing that the originals were locked safely in my office and backed up in multiple digital locations in case Victor or anyone else tried to make them disappear. The clubhouse was a large room on the ground floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the courtyard, a space usually reserved for birthday parties and book clubs and the kind of community events that made residents feel like they were part of something larger than just a building where they happened to live. But tonight, it had been transformed into something more formal, more official, with a long table set up at the front where the board members would sit and rows of chairs arranged facing them where residents could observe the proceedings if they chose to attend. I was surprised to see that nearly 30 residents had already gathered, far more than usually showed up for routine board meetings. And I realized that word had spread through the building faster than I had anticipated, that people had heard rumors about an ethics complaint against the HOA president and had come to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. And I could feel their eyes on me as I walked to a seat in the third row, could sense the whispered conversations and speculations about what I knew and what I was prepared to reveal, and whether this was really about building governance or just a personal vendetta disguised as civic duty. Ms. Patel was already seated at the front table, her laptop open in front of her and a stack of documents arranged in neat piles beside her, and she looked up when I entered and gave me a small nod of acknowledgement. Nothing more, just enough to let me know that she had reviewed everything I had sent her and was prepared to handle the meeting according to the procedures that governed how these matters were supposed to be addressed. The other board members arrived over the next 10 minutes, taking their seats at the front table with expressions that ranged from curious to uncomfortable to openly hostile, and I could see them glancing at the empty chair where Victor usually sat, the president's chair at the center of the table, and I knew they were wondering whether he would show up at all or whether he would try to skip the meeting and claim that the whole process was illegitimate because he had not been given proper notice or adequate time to prepare a defense. At exactly 6 o'clock, the board chair, a retired engineer named Harold Chen, who had always struck me as someone who valued rules and procedures above personal relationships, called the meeting to order and announced that due to the nature of the complaint being reviewed, Victor Hale would not be presiding over this session and would instead be given an opportunity to respond to the allegations after the evidence had been presented and the board had been given a chance to ask questions. Victor walked in 30 seconds later, his timing clearly calculated to make an entrance, to project confidence and control even though he was walking into a room where his authority had been temporarily suspended and his conduct was under official scrutiny, and he took a seat in the front row on the opposite side of the room from where I was sitting. And I could feel the weight of his stare even though I did not turn to look at him, could sense that he was trying to intimidate me one last time, trying to make me doubt myself or second-guess the decision to bring this complaint forward. Harold Chen cleared his throat and stated that the board had received an ethics complaint filed by Building Superintendent Ethan Grant, alleging that board president Victor Hale had abused his administrative access to the incident report system, had deleted or edited reports without proper authorization, and had subsequently engaged in retaliation and intimidation against the complainant after the complaint was filed, and that the board was convened tonight to review the evidence, hear from both parties, and determine what action, if any, should be taken in response to these allegations. Ms. Patel stood and walked to the front of the room where a projector had been set up, and she connected her laptop and pulled up the first document, the audit log summary showing Victor's username accessing the incident report database at odd hours over the past 6 weeks, and she walked the board through each entry, explaining what each action code meant, pointing out the pattern of late-night access followed by report deletions or modifications, and noting that none of these actions had been documented in the board minutes or reported to the full board as required by the record-keeping policies that were supposed to ensure transparency and accountability. She moved on to the next document, the screenshot of the deleted noise complaint draft that had mentioned my floor, and she explained that this report had been filed by the previous night doorman and then removed from the system entirely without any explanation or follow-up, and that the only person who had accessed that report between the time it was filed and the time it disappeared was Victor Hale. She continued through the evidence methodically, showing the keycard access logs that matched the visitor book entries, showing the timeline of Friday night visits that corresponded with the dates when reports had been edited or deleted, and then she pulled up Caruso's witness statement about the lobby confrontation, reading it aloud in her calm and measured voice. And I watched the faces of the board members as they listened, saw some of them glancing at Victor with expressions that had shifted from skepticism to concern to something that looked almost like betrayal, as if they were realizing for the first time that the man they had trusted to lead them had been using his position to cover up his own misconduct and had been willing to threaten an employee to keep that misconduct hidden. Harold Chen asked Ms. Patel if she had verified the authenticity of the audit logs and the other digital records, and she confirmed that she had cross-referenced everything with the building's IT contractor and that all of the evidence was legitimate and had not been tampered with or altered in any way. Harold Chen then turned to Victor and asked him if he wanted to respond to the allegations, if he had any explanation for why he had been accessing the incident report system outside of normal business hours and why reports had been deleted or modified without board authorization. And Victor stood up and walked to the front of the room with the kind of calm assurance that suggested he had prepared for this moment, that he had a story ready that would make everything seem reasonable and justified. He said that as board president, he had a responsibility to review incident reports to ensure that they were accurate and complete, that he had noticed some reports contained errors or incomplete information, and had made corrections to protect the building from potential liability issues, and that he had not documented these actions in the board minutes because they were routine administrative tasks that did not require full board approval. And he looked directly at me as he said this, his expression challenging me to contradict him, daring me to accuse him of lying in front of everyone. Harold Chen asked him about the deleted noise complaint, asked why that report had been removed entirely rather than corrected, and Victor hesitated for just a fraction of a second before saying that the complaint had been filed in error, that the doorman had misunderstood what he had heard, and had reported voices that turned out to be coming from a television in an adjacent unit, and that he had deleted the report to avoid cluttering the system with false information that could create confusion later. One of the other board members, a woman named Patricia, who had always been friendly to me in the hallways, raised her hand and asked Victor why he had not mentioned any of this to the board before, why the first time anyone was hearing about his system access and report modifications was after a formal complaint had been filed, and Victor's expression tightened slightly as he said that he had not thought it was necessary to burden the board with minor administrative details, that he had been trying to streamline processes and reduce unnecessary paperwork. Patricia was not satisfied with that answer, and she pointed out that the bylaws specifically required board members to document any actions taken regarding building records, that transparency was not optional but mandatory, and that Victor's claim that he was just doing routine administrative work did not explain why he had confronted the complainant in the lobby and made threats about employment consequences, and I saw Victor's composure slip for the first time, saw his jaw clench and his hands tighten on the back of the chair he was gripping, and he said that he had simply tried to have a private conversation with me to understand why I was filing complaints instead of coming to him directly, that he had not threatened anyone, and that if I felt intimidated, that was a misunderstanding of his intentions rather than evidence of actual misconduct. Harold Chen looked at Caruso, who was sitting in the back row in his doorman uniform, and asked him if he would be willing to describe what he had witnessed in the lobby. And Caruso stood and said in his quiet and steady voice that he had heard Victor tell me that I was making a serious mistake, that I had no idea what I was dealing with, and that Victor had stepped close to me in a way that seemed designed to intimidate rather than facilitate conversation, and that Victor had clearly stated that the board would not believe my complaint and that I would regret filing it. The room went silent after Caruso finished speaking, and I watched the board members exchange glances, watched them realize that this was not just about administrative procedures or record-keeping errors, but about a pattern of behavior that included abuse of access, destruction of evidence, and retaliation against someone who had dared to call attention to it. Harold Chen called for a brief recess, and the board members huddled together at the front table, speaking in low voices while the rest of us sat in uncomfortable silence. And I could see Victor standing alone near the windows, his back to the room, his posture rigid and defensive, and I knew that he was realizing that the story he had prepared was not going to be enough, that the evidence was too clear and the witness testimony too damning, and that the board was going to have to choose between protecting him and protecting the integrity of the organization. The board reconvened after 15 minutes, and Harold Chen announced that they had reviewed the evidence and the testimony and had determined that Victor Hale's conduct constituted a serious violation of the bylaws and the ethical standards expected of board members, and that a vote would be taken immediately on whether to remove him from his position as president and revoke his administrative access to building systems pending a full investigation into the extent of the record tampering and whether any other reports had been improperly modified or deleted. The vote was called, and I watched as each board member raised their hand in favor of the motion, 4 votes in total with only 1 abstention from a member who said he felt uncomfortable making such a significant decision without more time to review the implications. And Harold Chen recorded the vote in the minutes that Ms. Patel was typing in real time on the projector screen where everyone could see the words appearing. Motion passes 4-1. Victor Hale removed from position of board president effective immediately, administrative access revoked pending investigation. Victor stood frozen for a moment, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly, and then he pulled his access badge from his pocket and dropped it on the table with a sharp clatter that echoed through the silent room, and he walked toward the exit without looking at anyone. But as he passed my row, he stopped and leaned down close enough that only I could hear him whisper that this was not over, that I had destroyed more than just his position on the board, that I would regret turning a private matter into a public spectacle. And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, and I sat there feeling nothing but the cold satisfaction of knowing that the first piece had fallen exactly as I had planned.